Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you didn't watch the last video, go and watch it for the context to the next season. This episode will go over Season 3, so let's get straight into it. Season 3, Episode 1 and 2. These episodes would be the same, but with the addition of Shane and Jim, they would get into the prison easier. Season 3, Episode 3, Walk With Me. Walk With Me would go over what happened to Dale after the farm. He gets saved by Michonne and would stumble across a helicopter crash. He would also be suspicious of the governor, so when Michonne leaves, Dale would too. I think that the governor would still send his right-hand men after him, Merle and Daryl. Michonne would get away, but Daryl would end up killing Dale. Season 3, Episode 4, Killer Within. This episode would be mostly the same, with Andrew setting off the alarms causing the walkers to get in. Lori would still give birth and die, but the major difference is that Jim would sacrifice himself and get bit to save T-Dog. Jim would die and T-Dog wouldn't get lost like Carol did and would help the group. Season 3, Episode 5, Say the Word. This episode would stay the same. Season 3, Episode 6, Hounded. This episode would be mostly the same, except for the voices Rick hears over the phone. He would hear Amy and Andrea, Carol, and Lori. And instead of Maggie and Glenn going for the baby formula, it would be Shane and Maggie. This will greatly affect the rest of the season and Season 4. Also, Michonne doesn't show up at the prison. Season 3, Episode 7, When the Dead Come Knocking. In this episode, we see the interaction between Merle and Daryl and Shane. This would be more peaceful than Glenn because he and Merle have less animosity. Merle and Daryl would apologize for robbing the camp and would tell Shane about Woodbury. Shane and Maggie would go back to the prison and tell the group about his interaction, and they would discuss going to Woodbury. Season 3, Episode 8, Made to Suffer. This episode, we would get introduced to Tyrese, Sasha, Ben, and Alan. But the rest of the episode would be different. This episode, Rick would decide that the group would go to Woodbury, and the episode would end with the governor telling the group, "Welcome to Woodbury." Season 3, Episode 9, The Suicide King. This episode would be completely different. Most of the episode would be the group getting used to Woodbury and getting their jobs. The end of the episode would be Maggie finding all the heads in the tanks that the governor had. Season 3, Episode 10, Home. This episode would start with Maggie telling Rick about the heads. Rick would see the governor in the distance, who has no clue they knows. Rick would tell Maggie to keep this secret until necessary. The rest of the episode would be people adjusting to Woodbury and Maggie trying to find any more evidence on the governor. Season 3, Episode 11, I Ain't a Judas. This episode would start out with Maggie sneaking into the governor's house. She would open a book and see the name Penny written on it. As soon as she does this, the governor walks in and sees her. He would get her put in a cell of sorts, and when the Walker event happens, he would reveal what Maggie did and say she is going to be executed. Rick would be pleading with the governor to let her go, but he wouldn't budge, and right before he pulls the trigger, Shane would shoot his gun, disarming him. This would cause a distraction for Maggie to grab his gun and shoot him point blank in the eye. The governor's men would start a shootout that would result in the casualties of Ben, Alan, and Axel. Season 3, Episode 12, Clear. Clear would be the same, but with Shane replacing Michonne and scenes of the group getting Woodbury back into good condition. Season 3, Episode 13, Arrow on the Doorstep. This episode would start with Glenn going out on a perimeter check. He would get taken by the governor, who we would pick up with the events of 2 episodes ago and how the governor and his men escaped. This episode would also have a scene where the governor would beat Glenn and send him back to Woodbury to tell Rick where to meet him. Season 3, Episode 14, Pray. This episode would be Daryl and Merle heading to Woodbury and explaining their plan to take out the governor. It would be the same as what Merle did in canon. The rest of the episode would be the group discussing if they should do this. The group would decide that Merle and Daryl should do it to prove themselves. Season 3, Episode 15, This Sorrowful Life. This episode would be similar to the episode in our timeline, but the change is that Merle having both hands and Daryl, they would be able to kill all of the governor's men except Martinez, and they would think that they killed the governor. Season 3, Episode 16, Welcome to the Tombs. This episode would be the group going to the governor's camp and rounding up the rest of his people and bringing them back to Woodbury. At the end, Daryl and Merle would go up to Rick and Shane and say that they are leaving. Rick and Shane would understand this and shake their hands,